Hello, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Co-Buying Property with Friends webinar with Phil Levin. For those of you who are new to FIC, a warm welcome to you. And to those of you who are returning or taking the co-housing course, it's wonderful to see you again. My name is Ryan, and I'm the Community Engagement Assistant here at the Foundation for Intentional Community. I'm happy to be joining you today from Folksville Farm in Knox, Maine. I'm your host for this webinar, so if you encounter any Zoom issues, please send me a message via the chat box, and I'll be more than happy to assist you. Now I'm going to introduce our presenter, Phil Levin. Phil has started two intentional communities, RGB, an 11-person rented community in San Francisco, and Radish, a 14-person co-owned community in Oakland. He also founded and co-edits the Super Nuclear blog on starting communities and co-buying property. Phil wants more people to live by the obvious truth that we are happiest, healthiest, and most productive surrounded by people we love and admire. He wants more communities to get created and more people to live in them. Phil is a pragmatist and believer in done in better than perfect when it comes to setting up new communities. He spends his spare time helping communities set up legal structures and financing systems that are robust enough to work, but simple enough to not get in the way of things happening in the first place. And with that, I'm happy to welcome Phil Levin. Thank you so much for joining us today, Phil, and imparting your wisdom upon us. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you so much, FIC, for hosting this. This is the third time we've done this webinar on this topic. And I think it was a lot of fun the last two times. I'm excited to do it with a new group. And it's great to see all the people writing down what they're trying to do and the number of people that are trying to start communities and improve their own communities. And it's like, it feels like with coming out of the pandemic, there's a lot of momentum for this sort of thing. So I'm excited to share what we've learned in the process, and we'll get to it. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. Okay, so I'm going to take everyone through a presentation. It's pretty information dense. There's a lot of slides, a lot of stuff. We will send out the slides at the end, so don't worry if you don't catch every little detail. And what I'm going to ask people in terms of questions is, if there's something that doesn't make sense, like something that you think should be clarified for the group, please write it into the chat, and I will try to see that, and Ryan will help me as well. We're going to leave like general discussion for the end. So if you want to talk about like your community and your dream and what you're, what you're trying to solve right now, definitely want to get into that, but we're going to try to do that at the end rather than sort of during the presentation itself. So I will get going. So Ryan mentioned, but along with Jillian Morris, I co-edit a blog on co-buying property and co-living in intentional communities called Super Nuclear. You can subscribe to it at supernuclear.substack.com. We put out all sorts of information that we think is pragmatic and useful for communities. Okay, so let's talk about co-buying. Co-buying is really awesome. And I'm going to give you an example, which is a community we recently started in Oakland called the Radish. At Radish, we have sort of a core principle of the community, which is that we are happiest surrounded by people we love and admire, and that these people make us the best possible versions of ourselves. We call this the obvious truth. Because it is not rocket science. It's a pretty obvious thing that people are like, of course that's true. But the question is, do we design our lives around this truth? And we think intentional community is a way to design around this truth, whereas a lot of people naturally do not do this. So here's a picture of our first day at Radish. We just bought the property, and there was this wall that was breaking up our living room that needed to come down. And so we dressed up in tuxedos and wedding dresses and fancy dresses, grabbed the sledgehammer and took down the wall. And that was our first night at Radish together. The very first thing we built when we got the property is we had this big empty yard with nothing in it. And we're like, it needs a hot tub. And so we plunked down a wooden hot tub in the middle of the yard. Since then, other things have come in around it. But the hot tub was sort of our first project, which is a lot of fun. And here's a picture of our communal building that we built at Radish. And so we built a building from scratch. It's a shared living room and kitchen, and we eat there pretty much every meal together. And it's not always a formal meal. It's not always like someone's assigned the cook sort of sit down meal, but people are always in there cooking. We share food together. So it's very easy just to go in the shared fridge, grab some shared food and make a shared meal for whoever's around. And this is sort of like, I call it the killer app of co-living, is making meals for each other. It's like, it's much easier to cook for 11 people than cook for yourself 11 times. And so there's sort of economies of scale. This is an RV we got and threw in the backyard and used it as a guest room and sort of study area. We recently redesigned it and actually got in 4 different design magazines, which is a cool project to do together. So anyways, that's Radish. And I put this forward to sort of give you a flavor of like the community environment I live in now and we've created recently. But of course, everyone's doing a different sort of community, sort of to their own style. And that's great. Okay, so let's talk about starting more communities. And so a lot of people in the chat are saying they want to start communities, and that's great. That's fantastic. What I've noticed is that there's this like funnel, which is there's a lot of people that want to start communities, and there's very few people who actually end up doing it. And I sort of liken it to writing a book. A lot of people at some point in their life say, I want to write a book. Very few people actually end up writing a book. And so the question is like, what happens? Like, what's the thing that stops all these people from doing these things? And that's really the topic of today's conversation, is like, what are all the barriers that sort of get you from, I want to do this thing, to actually doing it? And the overall sort of theme I want to impart on people is that intentional communities are built by idealists who learn to be pragmatists. And so a lot of people that want to start communities have these big ideals for how they should be and like what they should be about. And it's great to have these ideals. At the end of the day, you actually have to make something happen. And it often means getting pragmatic and sort of choosing what values are most important to you and letting the things that maybe are not actually necessary go. And so my sort of like mantra for people is done is better than perfect. Get it done. Egalitarian isn't always the answer. And we'll talk about this where this might not be the case in a second. And don't try to reinvent everything all at once. People have started communities before. People have certainly done real estate projects before. Sort of, if there's a script to follow the script, as long as it is fitting your ideals. All right. So what makes this thing hard? I think there's really 3 things that makes building these communities hard. The first is our entire built environment is designed for singles and small nuclear families. And so there's not that many like ready-made communal living spaces out there. And often you need to like renovate or like build property to make it work for community. And by doing that, you're sort of playing the role of a real estate developer. This is what a real estate developer does. And so you need to like learn a whole new toolkit of skills. The second is that our financial system, and we'll talk about finance a lot, is really designed for single or couple owners. And so if you're raising money from multiple parties, you need to think of a creative way to structure things. And often the banks won't be familiar with sort of groups buying together. The third thing that makes this hard is our zoning code has generally never heard of communal living. And so you're applying for permits and they're not always that easy to get. So at the end of the day, you sort of have to learn how to like love a lot of these problems. And they're not like community problems. They're sort of like real estate problems. You need to learn how to love financial models. You need to learn how to love uncomfortable convos about money with people. You need to learn how to love zoning code and really get into it. You need to learn how to love Zillow. You really need to learn how to love Zillow. And you need to learn how to love arguing with contractors. And these are all the things that you sort of need to know in order to start a community. So we're gonna go through some of these basic principles today. The agenda we're gonna follow is the who, which is picking your co-buying squad. So who are the people you're actually doing this with? How do you find them? The what, which is defining what your project is. So like, what are your basic requirements for your community? The how, locating finance and defining legal structure. We're going to spend most of the time there. And the where. So how do you actually go about finding your property? All right, let's talk about the who. So picking your co-buying squad. All right, so the who's really important. If you get this wrong, your project's not going to work out well. And so you really need to think hard about who you're doing this with. And I think there's a couple things they need to be. The first is they need to be aligned with you and share a vision. That's sort of obvious. The second is they need to be willing to put in work because there's a lot of work to be done to make these things happen. And the third is they need to be people you really want to be in community with, because at some point in the process, this will get hard. And when it gets hard, you want to like turn to the people and say like, I'm willing to put in the work to make it happen, to live with these people. And if they're not people you really want to do this with, at some point you're going to be like, I'm not so sure. And the people also need to bring things to the table. And so there's really three things I think people need to bring sort of in your co-buy squad, like the people you're actually buying a property with. And one is access to financing. So like inevitably you're doing a project that's going to cost a fair amount of money. Generally, property is just expensive. And so like someone in the group needs to be able to access money. They either need to have money, know people that have money, know how to get money. Like money needs to come into this at some point. And if no one in your co-buying squad knows how to get their hands on money, it's hard to do a project. The second is an eye for design. So usually you're like revamping or renovating or like doing something around design to make it work for a community. And so like it's great to have someone on the team who really like can see things and make them happen. And the third is like the ability to like sell a vision. So like you're telling a big story. You're telling a story to people that are going to live there. You're telling a story that people are going to finance you. You're sort of telling a story to everyone. And you need people that can like tell this story well. So that's who needs to be. I'll tell you how we did this at Radish, which is we actually kept it very simple at Radish, which is myself and my partner, Kristen, were the co-buy squad. And so the two of us bought Radish initially, and we involved people later. So we bought it, and then we brought people in on top of that. And so there's sort of this like hierarchy that you can think about. So the co-buying squad is the people that actually physically buy the place. It's like who gets on title when the thing is bought. And for us, that was me and Kristen. And we also actually had a friend who invested some money at that point who didn't live there, who sort of put in some money to help us make it happen. The next sort of layer in the hierarchy is founding residents. So it's like, who's going to move in once this thing is bought? And that could be a bigger group than just the co-buying squad. So it might be those people like who are not involved in the project and making it happen, but move in right after. And so we call those founding residents. At Radish, that was 7 people. And then we have current residents. So it's like the people who live there now. So 13 people live at Radish now. And so what you'll notice is like we sort of layered people in at different points in the project. We didn't start with the whole group because it's pretty hard to coordinate 13 people for a project. You usually need to start a little smaller and then slowly expand it as you need to. So easy ways to mess up the who. I've talked to a lot of people who've tried to start communities, and here's how I've seen the who go wrong. The number one way I see the who go wrong is a fuzzy squad. And so the fuzzy squad is like, you post something on Facebook and you're like, who wants to start a community with me? And 20 people respond, and they're all like sort of involved in the project. You don't want people sort of involved in the project in the early stages. You like want people who are like really involved in the project. And and I think you need to be like very clear about like the boundaries of like who are the people actually making decisions on like how this project is going to go forward. And it should be as small a group as it can possibly be. The more people, the harder it is. So the second issue I see with the who is that no one falls in love with like the process, like the real estate development process. And like someone's got to like, get into this stuff. Otherwise it doesn't happen. The third big thing I see is no access to capital. So you can have all the passion in the world. If you can't get money to do a project, you can't do a project. And so like someone in the squad needs to have access to capital to make this happen. All right, let's talk about the what. So the second sort of big thing, which is defining your basic property requirements. So I recommend there's 4 things you define up front with the what. And number 1 is geography. So like, where are you going to do this and make this specific as possible? The second is the number of people who are going to live there. And it doesn't need to be exact, but some sort of range. The third is the must-have features. So like, what are things that you will not do a project for if they don't have that thing? And the fourth is how fancy. And so here's an example of how we like did this at Radish, how we defined this originally before we bought it. So geography, we said we want a 35-minute public transit commute to San Francisco or less. And the reason we said this is a bunch of us had jobs in San Francisco. And so that was like a hard requirement. We didn't want to commute. Commuting sucks. And so we made that our geographical sort of like limit. The second thing we said is the number of people we wanted was 10 to 15. The third thing we said is must-have features were a nice outdoor space and at least 3 private units, because we wanted to raise kids there. And we thought that private units would be important for raising kids. And so the fourth thing we said is how fancy. I like using the Yelp scale here. And so, if you think of like Yelp restaurant scale, we said we want $2 signs out of 4. So we're not going to be the cheapest place there is. We're not going to be super fancy. We're going to be $2 signs out of 4. We're going to be like a Thai food restaurant, and which means we're not going to cut costs everywhere we can, but we're not going to splurge. And so that's sort of a helpful thing to align people on, because you get a lot of conflict when people disagree on how fancy. All right, easy ways to mess up the what. Too broad of geography. It's really hard to find a property if you're looking everywhere all at once. You need to focus in somewhere to really make something happen. The second is avoiding the conversation around how fancy until like later. If there's misalignment here, you're never going to cover it. So it's you need to nail that down. And the third is, and this is really the big one, is confusing your nice to haves with your must haves. You're probably not going to find the perfect property. It's really hard to find the perfect thing. You need to find something that's perfect enough. And here's where the pragmatism comes in. And so you really need to nail down what is super critical and what is it would be great if we had that, but it's not a requirement to move forward. All right, let's go to the how. So here's the meat of it. Let's talk about financing. So the first thing you want to do while starting a project, and I'm going to take you through a bunch of steps here, is you need to figure out how much your project is going to cost, roughly. And so I call this the TPC, the total project cost, and it's defined as the cost to purchase your property plus the cost of any critical renovations or constructions. And so I saw people want to do rural projects, projects on land, which is great. In that case, your total project cost is the cost of the land plus the cost of whatever you need to build on the land to get it going. And so it might be you need to dig a septic tank, you need to build some structures, whatever the thing is, that is part of your total project cost. And so here's sort of a helpful guide of how you might estimate it. And I'll give you the examples of how we did this for Radish. So you start with the cost per square foot of property in your city. And Zillow, fortunately, actually has this. So you can go to Zillow and type in whatever city you want to do this in, and it will give you the rough cost per square foot of real estate there. And so Oakland, where we were doing Radish, is, of course, insanely expensive. And the cost of property there are somewhere between $500 to $600 per square foot. And you can look this up. This will probably be a lower number if you're doing this outside the Bay Area. The second part of your TPC is your square foot per person. So how much space do you need per person? And I've sort of put in 300 to 500 here as I think this is a typical range for intentional communities. And so our first property, RGB in San Francisco, was about 300 square feet per person. Radish, which is sort of more suburban and has more space, is about 500 square feet per person. But, I think most communities sort of fall somewhere in that range. And the third thing you need to multiply with is your number of people. And so at Radish, we were aiming for 10 to 15 people. And so we did the math here and we said, how much is our project going to cost? And you get a range of $1.5 to $4.5 million, which is a lot of money. And so we looked at this, we're like, oh my God, this is a lot of money. How are we going to pull this project off? And yeah, here's actually Redfin's where you find this. So if you go to Redfin, you type in your city or county, there's a little thing at the bottom here, which says, cost per square foot in Oakland is $597. So you can do this for whatever city you're in. Okay, so your second step, once you've calculated your project cost, is to estimate your down payment. So this is how much cash you need to buy the property. Generally, if you're getting a loan from a bank for this sort of thing, the bank will lend you between 60 and 70% of the cost of the property. So you might have heard of 80% LTV loans for buying a house, 20% down. You generally can't do that for multifamily sort of, more unique projects. The bank will generally lend you a little less. So 30 to 40% is usually sort of where these things end up in terms of down payment. And So our down payment for Radish was estimated to be $450,000 to $1.8 million of down payment of cash, which is a lot of cash. And so we sort of did a thing where we looked at this number and we said, oh my God, like there's no way we can get $1.8 million of cash. That's way too much. So we actually need to like sort of downsize our project a bit. And then this is the reason why you do this step now, is to like understand basically what's like feasible. And so we sort of said like, maybe we're actually looking on like the lower side of number of people instead of the higher side of it. And if any of this is not making sense, toss it in the chat and I'll slow down and go over something again. Okay, step 3. Decide what financial contributors get. So now you know how much money you need. And for us, it was $450,000 to $1.8 million. And so now we got to go figure out like, how are we going to get this money? And like, what do people get for putting this money in this project? And I think there's really like 3 big questions to answer up front. There's like a lot of details on this stuff. Like, you'll have a complicated legal document by the end of this, but like up front, there's really like 3 big questions I think you need to figure out early. And so the first question is when people put in money to this project, is there a financial return, and how much is the return? And this is the first question anyone will ask, of course. The second question is how and when do I get my money back? So if I put money in now, when do I get it back? And can I take it out of the project at any point? And the third big question is who makes the big decisions around money? So if I'm putting my money into something, I want to know like who's going to decide when we sell, who's going to decide whether we invest in something, who's going to decide what renovations we do. And so you sort of want to know like how the big decisions are made with regard to the property. So I'll tell you how we answer these questions at Radish. And I put this forward as not like the only answers. I think there's a lot of answers to these questions you can put forward, but here's like what we told our investors. So we said, first of all, yes, there will be a financial return if you put in money, because the money is big enough where it's like, we didn't think people are just going to put in money with no return. It's like too much money. And so we said, we're going to target a yearly 5% return on capital. So if you put in $100,000, we're going to try to give you back $5,000 of return every year is our goal. We will not compensate people for labor was sort of the other piece of this. So like we did a lot of work to start this and we said, this is for the love of the game. We're not going to try to make money as sort of people doing the project. Other communities decide to compensate for labor. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just something we decided not to do at Radish. The second question we asked at Radish is how when can I get my money back? And I think we did something that actually like made this project a lot easier, which is we said, we're going to sell Radish in 5 to 10 years from when we buy it. And I see a lot of communities trying to operate as sort of like perpetual entities and like exist for the next century. And that's great. Like, it's great to have communities last a while. Doing that complicates your financial model quite a bit because when people put in money, there's not an easy way for them to get their money back. And people tend to not to like to put their, put a, big chunk of money in and say like, well, I don't know if I'm going to get back anytime in the next 20 years. So by saying we're going to sell within 10 years, we sort of gave investors like an idea of like what sort of investment this is. And like when they can expect it back. Paige asked a great question, which is how did you figure getting a 5% return? Where did the number come from? And so where we basically got this from is we looked at typical returns for real estate in the area, and we found they were like between like 4 and 7%, something like that. And you can look this up. The term for this is right in the chat. Is called the cap rate. The real estate term for this, which is basically like how much money does real estate return when you, let's say you're just going to buy a thing and rent it to like some random people. And so what we basically said was like, we're not trying to make a lot of money off this, but like we're going to make people amount of money that's like typical for an investment like this, but like sort of on the lower end of it. And so that's where 5% came from for us. And I think you could do a lower number. I think you do a bigger number. There's nothing holy about this number. It's just the number that we ended up using. Okay, the third big one for Radish was who makes the big money decisions. We made a decision here which made this very simple, which is we said me and Kristen, my partner, who started this and put in a lot of the money to get it started, we said, we are the benevolent dictators. And all the big decisions around like, when are we going to sell the property? When are we going to build new buildings? All this stuff, we said, we're going to take input from the community. This is for the community, but like at the end of the day, the two of us are going to make the decision. This may not be how you want to do your community. And I do not recommend this necessarily. It is a way to make things simple because it's like very clear to investors like how this works. It's very clear to everyone how this works. But it might be you do this differently. I'm involved in another project now where we have a different structure and we sort of have like a voting mechanism where like 65% of the people involved need to vote yes for things. So there's different ways of doing this, but that's how we did it at Radish. So decision-making structures. There's not like one answer for how you make decisions in a community. Different decisions require different levels of buy-in. And so what you need to think about is like, who is making what decision at what level? And so we sort of start with like the big ones up here, like we call these the big money decisions: selling property, refinancing property, setting rents, building a new building if you're gonna have rent. And then there's some smaller decisions, like what kind of toilet paper you can carry, how's a food program gonna work, things like that. And so we sort of differentiate between like what are like property decisions that like are big money decisions and like what are sort of like smaller community decisions. And for each of these, there's like a potential group of people that may help decide this. And here's a bunch of options on like how you can get this done. And so for Radish, we sort of said these big things are benevolent dictatorship, and the small things are like community consensus and democracy. This is how we ended up doing sort of the small things. All right. Feel free, if there's things that don't make sense, just put a question in the chat and I'll either come to it now or at the end. Cool. So what's the next step? Okay, so you now figure out like how you're going to go about structuring like your investments, basically, with those big questions. So your next step in doing this community is you need to go out and get soft commitments. And a soft commitment is people who are going to put money to make this thing happen. Here's what a soft commitment sounds like. It's somebody telling you, ideally in writing, I will likely put in X amount of money if you buy a property within the next year along the lines of what you proposed. And so a soft commitment is a very specific commitment. It's not like, oh, I'd like to put in money, but we're not going to talk about how much or when or like for what. The soft commitment's got to be like around the specifics of your project. And so I think if your soft commitment doesn't have the things in bold, which is an amount of money, a time frame, and an acknowledgement of what the project is and how the project's going to work, then it's not a soft commitment. That's a fuzzy commitment. And so you need people at this point to make soft commitments that are like real commitments and not fuzzy commitments. And if you can't get soft commitments for the project at this point, you got to go back to your steps above. You got to go back to the what, you got to go back to the who, and you got to figure out like, how can you change the project so people are actually willing to commit money to the project? Paige asked if some investors did not live at Radish. Actually, I'll get to that a little bit later. All right, step 5. So you've got your soft commitments. So people are ready to put in money. That's great. What's your next step? Your next step is to validate that bank financing is available. And so if you're buying a single family home in the suburbs, banks will lend to you all day long. You can go on a website, type in your stuff, and they'll be like, here's your loan. Banks are set up to do loans for single family homes in the suburbs. Banks will not necessarily do a loan for your crazy community projects. And so what you need to do is make sure that at this point that a bank is actually willing to lend you money for your project. And so we have a suggestion for how to do this, which is doing a dry run. And so the way a dry run works is that before you found your perfect property, you sort of tell the bank you're going to buy another property. And you pick a property that's like sort of like one you want to do, but not quite the one you want to do. And you go to the bank and you tell them a little lie and you say, we're going to buy this property. You build a financial model, you send it to the bank, you say, we're going to buy this property. And at that point, the bank will basically tell you whether or not they're willing to finance it. And what you're like, and this is an important step because like, it will give you a sense of what the bank's willing to do and what they're not willing to do and on what terms they're willing to do it. What you do not want to have happen is you find your perfect property. You have like a week to do it before it goes off the market. And then you find out at the end of that the bank's not willing to give you a loan. And so this is why you do a dry run beforehand. You do a dry run beforehand because you know what the bank's willing to lend you. All right. Two main types of loans for doing a co-living property, and we can talk about loans all day long. I will just give you the very simple version of this. There's more stuff on super nuclear around this, but there's basically two kinds of loans you can do. One is a residential loan, which is like a loan for a person buying a house. And the second is a commercial loan, which is like, I'm going to buy a multifamily property for multiple people and they're going to pay rent into it. And it's more of a business transaction than somebody buying a home. Radish is a commercial loan. So we had multiple units. And so we did it as a commercial loan. And there's sort of different terms for these two kinds of loans. My advice to you is if you can do a residential loan, do a residential loan. They are simpler, they are cheaper. The problem with them is they are less flexible. And there's certain kinds of properties that a lender will not allow you to do a residential loan for, and you need to do a commercial loan. So do a residential loan if you can. If not, you're stuck with a commercial loan. Vicky asked a great question, which is, when you're buying land for a, can you lie about being intentional community? The answer is I think you can put things in words that a bank is willing to maybe see more favorably. So let's call it sort of stretching the truth. And so we sort of told them, we're going to buy a property and rent it out to people. And we're going to have a like communal building that the residents will share. And so both of those things are true. We didn't really get into the like, we're an intentional community, here's how we're going to run it. We didn't need to do that. And so we sort of told like we didn't tell them all the story. We sort of made it sound like it was like a normal thing that like a typical developer might do, even though we were doing it a bit weird on the back end. And I'll talk more about that later. All right. Let's talk about legal structure. This is the complicated stuff. Leo asked a question, which is, why did we do a commercial loan at Radish? The short story is Radish is a 5-unit property and you can't get a residential loan for a 5-unit property. You can only do commercial loans for that. So all right, legal structure. I'm going to put a bunch of big caveats here. The first one is, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a professional lawyer. This is not legal advice. If you're doing legal stuff, you need to talk to a real lawyer. The point of this is I'm going to give you like enough information to help you like orient yourself and probably like help ask a lawyer the right questions. So the second note of warning is that multiple structures likely work for every situation. And so I will give you some like sort of places to start and maybe recommendations, but like, don't take this as like, the word of God. There's usually multiple ways of getting things done. All right, here's the complicated flowchart slide. Quick sip of water. Here's my best guess as to what sort of legal structure you should use based on what kind of property you are. And here's the flowchart to get there. So the first question is, how many people will own the property? And if you're doing some like benevolent dictatorship where like one person is just the property owner and everyone's coming to live in the community, but they're not going to be owners of the community, there's a very simple answer to this, which is like that person should just own the property and that person is just on title and they do a normal lease to whoever's going to live there. So that's sort of this branch. So if you're lucky enough to have one person that's going to own it, that's great. Things are really simple. A lot of you will not have the situation. You'll have a situation where more people will own it. And so then you come to a second question, which is, will the residents own a specific private space? Like, will they own their own unit, or will they just pay rents based on what space they reside in? And so an example of structure where people own their own specific unit is co-housing. So in co-housing, like, you buy your unit in the community. In that case, you're sort of on the left side here. So people owning their space. There's another structure, which is what we actually did at Radish, which we'll talk about in a second, where it's like people don't own their individual units. They own like a percentage of the whole property. And so if you want a structure like that, and I'll talk about this more in detail in a second, the recommendation here is to do an LLC on the title, and you lease to the people who live in each unit. And I'll talk about that model in a second. But let's say people are going to own their own private specific living space. I see people are interested in TICs. There's basically sort of three. The next sort of question is like, what kind of property are you doing? And so if you're doing like a condo or a subdivision, there's an established way to handle this in the real estate world, which is an HOA, a homeowners association. And so like, if you're buying like a condo building, just do an HOA. HOAs are like pretty simple. You can write whatever you want into an HOA. It's a nice, easy structure that like lots of people are familiar with and banks will lend to, and so on and so forth. If you're doing a single family home or like a multifamily property that's not set up as like a condo, this is where like a TIC, a tenancy in common, comes into play. And so tenancy in common basically says like, you know, Bob owns this piece of it, Ryan owns this piece of it, and it's a structure that sort of divides up the property, sort of synthetically. And so that's probably the structure you're going to look at, which is a TIC, which is something that people do. It's not uncommon. It is not as common as an LLC. It's not as common as an HOA. So it's a bit more of an exotic thing, I think, in a lot of cases, but certainly something you can do. The third thing is land. So if you're doing a project on land, you have all sorts of options. There are structures like community land trust, PRECs, nonprofits. I don't know a huge amount about these structures. I think FIC has a lot of resources on this. So if you're interested in this, I suggest taking those out. And I think you can also do a TIC on land. Cool. So this slide's a lot. We'll send out the slides, but here's sort of my like where you start on legal structure advice. Okay, so I'm going to dig into the Radish model in more detail here, because I think it's actually a very good model for a lot of communities. And I think like everyone who's starting a community, I think should like think about like whether this model makes sense for them. It's worked very well for us. So the key sort of feature of the Radish model and like why it's useful is that it allows us to have an overlap in owners and residents. And so what we end up have happening in our community, and I think this will be the case in a lot of communities, is like people have different financial resource and they have different like willingness to like put in investment. And so at Radish, we have some people that like want to live at Radish, but they don't want to invest in Radish. It might be that they don't have enough savings and they just want to rent. On the other hand, we have people who like actually don't want to live at Radish, but are like supporters of the idea, who like want to put in money to like get us going, but actually don't want to live there. And so, and then there's a middle sort of section, the middle of the Venn diagram, which is people that want to actually both invest and live there. And so what the structure we came up with at Radish allows is it allows people to occupy any of these three sort of circles. And we find that people actually do want to occupy different spaces here. So, Radish is owned by an LLC. We call it Big Cabbage LLC. And and the way that it works is that everyone who lives at Radish, whether or not they're an investor, it doesn't matter. They live in a space on the property and they pay rent for that space. And so if you live in a big space, you pay higher rent. If you live in a small space, you pay lower rent. The amount of rent you pay has nothing to do with your level of investment. And so it just relates to the actual space that you're occupying. And that rent goes into the community. The community pays for its community expenses out of that. So it pays for food, utilities, so on and so forth. And then the community then sort of bundles up all this rents and sends it to the LLC. And so the LLC that runs the property basically charges the community as a whole a certain amount of rent for the whole property. And out of that rent, the LLC pays for expenses that are associated with owning the property. So they pay property tax, they pay insurance, they pay utilities, some utilities, stuff like that. And then the money that's left over after like these things are paid, get paid out to investors. And this is where the 5% investor return comes from. And so what's nice about this is like, I personally live at Radish, so I'm a resident. I pay rent for my room I live in. I'm also an investor. And so every month I pay money as a resident and then I get money as an investor. And so my like net money is the difference between like how much I'm an investor versus how much I'm a resident. And people can sort of like exist at any level in that spectrum they want to exist at. We have two layers of decision making. So we sort of talked about this before, but the community makes a lot of community decisions, and so they make decisions like, and the community means the residents who live at Radish. So they make decisions like who lives there, what are community values and practices, how does the food system work, do we want to put the couch on that side of the room or that side of the room? Those are all made by the community, and that's that. There's community decision-making mechanisms, and this is all made by the residents. And then there's these LLC decisions, which are things like when do we sell, do we build a new building? The managers of the LLC, meaning like the investors, basically make those decisions. And so there's these two decision layers: community, investors. And because I'm both an investor and a resident, I participate at both levels of these decisions. And if you're only a resident, you only participate at this level. If you're only an investor, you only participate at this level. Cool. So I'm going to skip over this bit. So in our model, how do investors get their money back? So we basically say there's one guarantee for how you get your money back, which is when we sell the property in 5 to 10 years, you're guaranteed to get your money back, or you're guaranteed to like, get whatever we get out of that. And then we say there's a second way you can get your money back, which is not guaranteed, and which is when new residents come in, we ask them to become investors, or we give them the opportunity to become investors. And at that point, they can buy out old investors. And so there's this sort of like intermediate liquidity events that happen as new residents come in and want to invest. And I think because we have a return on the investment, it's like easier to get people to do that. I think if there's no return on the investment, it's like harder to get people to put in money. So one principle we applied at Radish, which, we had the luxury of doing, but like you may not, depending on your circumstances, are we basically did not allow people to invest their whole nest egg. And so we said, you can only invest money that like, if it gets locked up for a while, or if like, something goes wrong and you'll get it back, it doesn't ruin your life. And so we didn't want people putting in all their money into this project. We didn't feel comfortable taking it. And so we have like a lot of people investing like a medium amount of money as opposed to, a few people investing a large amount of money, if that makes sense. So Leo has a couple of questions, which is, do we guarantee a 5% yearly return? The answer is no. So that is our target. That is what we're trying to achieve. And so every quarter we send out checks, and sometimes it's 4%, sometimes it's 5.5%, sometimes it's 4.5%. It sort of fluctuates, and we don't guarantee the amount. It's just what we're trying to hit. The really nice thing about having a target return is it makes it very clear to everyone how you should set rents. And so if you're very clear up front with everyone that investors get 5%, here's what rent needs to be to make that happen based on our expenses. It gives like a reason that rent is the way it is. And so it's not arbitrary when you're like, rent is gonna be this. It's not a number picked out of nowhere. It's like, it's a number that corresponds to like something that you agreed with the investors up front. And it also allows investors to not be like, why aren't you charging more rent? We say, no, we're trying to target 5% with the rent. Jonathan asked a question, which is, what if we have more than 5%? There's no waterfall, there's no split. We just try to average the 5%. So it's like sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, and we try to average to it. Cool. Is there a way of increasing your target returns through increasing rent and decreasing expenses? Yes, there is. And so what happens is if expenses go up for some reason, that's sort of the basis for a discussion with the community around maybe rent should go up too, because now expenses are higher. If expenses go down, like let's say, somebody moves in who's a handyman who like fixes all the stuff and we have a lower repair bill, in that case, we lower rent. And so we sort of like set rents, based on like what the expenses are and what our return expectations are. And so it allows us to sort of have like very like sort of like grown-up conversations around it without it being just like trying to extract from people. It's just like there's a reason rent is the way it is. Lots of questions around rent. These are good. How often do we set rents? So we sort of say we can adjust it annually, and we said we're not going to adjust it by more than 3% a year. So we sort of give like almost like a rent control that we assign ourselves. In reality, we've adjusted it less than that, but we sort of give ourselves permission to adjust it once a year. All right, so let's talk about some when shit goes wrong scenarios in the Radish model. So what if the community becomes a total unmanageable disaster? What if it's just not working at all? And so there's an easy thing to do here, which is that the LLC cancels the lease with the community and just sells the property. And so easy to sort of get out of this thing in this situation, or not easy, but there's a clear way to get out of things. The second question is, what if me and Kristen, my partner, have a falling out? So what if sort of the two managers of this thing start getting along? And so we basically put a thing in our agreement that says that either one of us individually is able to force the sale of the property. And so if it's like really like not going well, like we're not going to try to like figure it out. It's like we can just pull the eject thing and end the experiment. And everyone understands that this is the case, and this is sort of a risk. And it sort of protects us as people that have a big investment in this thing. The third is what happens when the LLC is ready to sell, but the community wants to stay. And so we could see a thing where the community buys the property from the LLC, like in 5 to 10 years. And the loan we have is something called it's an assumable loan. And so what that means is actually you can transfer the loan essentially to another party. And so this is a term on a loan that's available to you if you ask. And sometimes it costs more, but it might be worth it. Andrea asked, for sale, does community get for first right to buy? We don't have anything in the agreement for that, but like we would want the community to buy it. So I think we would try to make that happen. But it's more of like a social desire than something we've like, written in stone into a legal agreement. And, I think we like keeping things simple in the legal agreements. We don't like having like a lot of like 500 scenarios. The idea is that like the nice part of being a community is you're a community and you can like talk about these things with each other and try to figure out like how to work them out. But the sort of default in the legal agreement is like very black and white, which is just like the LLC makes a decision at the end of the day. All right, so easy mistakes to make in this whole process. Big one is not having hard, explicit conversations with the people you're counting on for money. You need to have this early on. Do not get to the end of the process and not have figured out where the money's coming from, who's getting it, and what they're getting in return. You need to do that early. The second is not doing a few dry runs on fake projects. So it's hard to buy property. We messed up like 5 times before we got it right. And so it was like important for us to like have experience under our belt before like the perfect property came on the market. And by that time we were like ready because we had like, tried it a couple times and made mistakes and like learned from our mistakes. I think the third mistake is wasting energy on potential projects before zeroing in on available financing. So If you can't finance the project, you can't do the project. And so it's like, you gotta figure that out up front. Fourth big mistake we see is overcomplicating legal structures. And my big advice, and you're going to talk to lawyers love overcomplicated things. You gotta like strive for simplicity here. And like, I would just keep asking over and over again, can I make this simpler? Can I make this simpler? Can I make this simpler? And my advice here is like, do not try to plan for every single scenario in the world that might happen. You're not going to succeed in doing that. You just want to make it very clear when something unexpected happens, who makes a decision on that thing. And so us, we have very clear decision making, but we're not trying to say like, if this happens, then this, and if it happens, then this, and this happens, then this, because it's like, it's hard to predict all these things. And then the fifth one's unclear decision making. You really need to just understand who's making decisions. And we made this super clear. We're like, it's me and Kristen, period, with the big property things. Cool. Ooh, a lot of questions here. All right, let's try to go through a couple questions. How long did you spend doing dry runs before you found the property you bought? It took us a year to find our property. And so we probably looked at 15 properties. We probably put offers on 3 of them. We got in contract on 1 of them, and then got out of contract, and then we found our property. And I'd say that was like a fairly maybe typical process. Jonathan asked for LLC commercial loan financing. Are they looking for debt to income ratios for each general partner of the LLC? For us, they did. And so we ended up guaranteeing the loan personally. And so they looked at our income against the debt for the loan. CAF, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked a question, which is, have you considered allowing renters to gain equity as a portion of their rent? We don't do that. I know communities that do that, but we sort of do something that's equivalent, which is like, at any point you can sort of buy into the LLC with any amount of money you have. And so, you know, doing the like monthly rent payments go towards equity is basically the same thing as just saying like, you save up a bit of money and then you put it in. They're sort of equivalent. They're not like totally different things. And so we do allow people to like get equity by putting in money. We don't do that via rent. We just do that separate from rent. All right. But I think it's something you could do. Cool. I'm probably going to skip the where. I think I've probably been talking for way too much. Let's get the people's questions, and let's get the people's situations. So I'm going to close here, and let's talk to folks.
Carolyn Anderson had asked, what constitutes return on capital? Do you mean that 100K someone put in gets invested somehow and dividends are paid? I thought that it would have been part of the down payment, and isn't everyone involved contributing to property taxes and other costs?
Great question. So return on capital simply means like, let's say Ryan puts in $100,000. Thank you, Ryan. Whether or not Ryan lives there, we sort of say, Ryan, our goal is to give you $5,000 back every year for putting in $100,000. And then there's an LLC that owns this property. The LLC takes in rent. The LLC has expenses. So the LLC takes in all the rent for the property. It has to pay things like property tax. It has to pay things like insurance. And then whatever money is left over, we distribute to Ryan and the other investors. And so we're targeting 5%. Sometimes 4%, sometimes 3%, sometimes 6%. We're targeting sort of on average 5%. Does that make sense?
I think so.
And so there's not like, people as individuals aren't paying property tax. It's like the LLC, the thing that owns the property, is paying the property tax. And then the money left over is what goes to the investors.
Looks like there's a follow-up from Chris in the chat. What if the LLC had community committee and then the LLC collected all of the rents and paid common property costs and investor profits? Would that be more efficient?
Yeah, I think you could do it that way. So what you're saying is sort of like merging the LLC and like the community entity. Um, I think you can do it that way. We like separating them just because it gives like a very clear like set of roles to each. So it's like the community is about the community, the LLC is about like managing the property. And there's this like simple way that they interact, which is one pays the other rent and the other provides a property for it. And so like we sort of control all of them as a community, but it's like they're sort of just controlled differently. But I think you could combine them in theory.
Mary would like to know, how do you find the co-buying squad? Can you turn people down who we don't want to work with or live with?
For sure. I think you definitely want to do this with people you really want to do this with. Like if you're uncertain about someone, do not do it with them. It's like a marriage. You're gonna like financially and marry the people and spending a lot of time with them and spending, solving a lot of challenges with them. And like if you don't jive with them, do not do this with them. You should feel really good about the people you do this with. And so you're not obligated to take anyone into your co-buying squad.
Liz wants to know, will the Radish model work in a rural location like in Eco Village?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I don't see why not. The one reason you would not use the Radish model is if you want people to own their individual units. So I've heard about eco village models where like there's the land and then each person like builds their own building on the land. And in that case, you might want each person to own their own building, which is not the Radish model. So the Radish model is like, there's just one thing that owns the whole thing. And so in an eco village model, if you want people to own their individual like building, you would not do the Radish model. You would do something like a TIC or a PREC or a condo or a HOA. There's a bunch of structures for that.
Kai wants to know, if it's financially possible to buy the place, just me and my partner, and sell it out later to others, what would be the reasons to not do that and involve other people in the beginning?
Great question. So I think it's a perfectly okay thing to do, to be honest. Like, it really simplifies things. And I think the reason not to do it is if you don't want like all the burden on yourself, if you want like other people who have like skin in the game and like, want to make this succeed financially, and like want to make it like work. It's sometimes great to have partners. And so I think that would be the reason to involve other people, even if you don't need to. But you don't have to.
All right, let's go back to the chat and see if there was anything that we missed there. Looks like Gaia is asking for more information on what about having the property owned by a housing cooperative instead of an LLC? Do you have info on that?
So I don't know a huge amount about housing cooperatives. I think people put like a lot of meaning into these like organizational terms, and the LLC sort of feels like sometimes is like an evil business thing, and the cooperative feels like a warm and gooey like community thing. They're all just like legal structures, right? They're all just like ways that the government recognizes what your thing is. And what I like about LLCs is that like you can do whatever you want with an LLC. You can run an evil LLC, you can run a good LLC, you can run an LLC however you want to run an LLC. You can have it governed however you want to govern. You can write whatever you want into your LLC operating document. You can say Ryan makes all the decisions. You can say a committee of children makes all the decisions. Like you can do whatever you want. And so I think like anything you can accomplish in a co-op, you can probably also accomplish in an LLC. Like an LLC is like very flexible. And what's nice about an LLC is like everyone in the world recognizes it. So like your bank knows what an LLC is, your insurance company knows what an LLC is, the city knows what an LLC is. And so I sort of push people towards LLCs a lot because I think it just makes your life easy. And you can still do anything you want to do with it. You can run it any way you want to run it. It doesn't limit you in any way. So but that being said, I don't know a huge amount about housing co-ops, so I couldn't tell you like what the challenges or benefits would be there specifically.
Mary Kay asked, in the Radish model, can you have home ownership as well as rental?
No. Yeah, so the Radish models only works if everyone who's renting, everyone lives there rents. Because and the reason for that is the LLC owns the whole property. And so you can't own part of the property if the LLC owns the whole property. And then that's what the Radish model is. If you want people to own individual property, again, TIC, condo, HOA are structures you should look into that.
Awesome. Deb Jones asked, under the Radish model, what types of insurance do you have beyond the property insurance?
Good question. We have normal homeowners insurance we have like extra general liability insurance. So we like up the liability because we're doing a weird thing, something may happen associated with that, and so we want protection basically if people sue you.
Jonathan asked, have you started considering how a refinance would take place for Radish and how the property would be valued?
Yeah, great question. We've actually done a refinance, and very easy. So if you own as an LLC, the bank just comes along and says they appraise the property, they look at the LLC, they see how much money it's made, they see that's covering its payments and expenses, and then they refinance you. And so we just did a refinance, zero drama. It works like a normal refinance. There's nothing special because it's a community.
Kai asks, what if the owners have perks over those who don't own part of the property? Should there be a lower limit to buying in?
So, say one more time. I didn't catch that.
What if the owners have perks over those who don't own part of the property? Should there be a lower limit to buying in?
Yeah. So you can choose whatever limit you want. In theory, you could do $1. People can buy for $1. The reason we don't recommend doing that is it just makes like running the thing really complicated to have like a lot of people who are sort of partial owners. It makes the accounting complicated. It makes the taxes complicated. It's just sort of a drag. And if you have a good reason to do that, you should do that. It's not that big of a deal. But we sort of said like anyone who's an owner, we want them to put in like a reasonable amount of money. Otherwise, like we're not going to go through the effort of like doing all the things we need to do to make you an owner, and like maintain you as an owner. And so we set a limit. I think we said for us it was $10,000 or $15,000 was our lower limit. Which is a fair amount of money, but it's sort of an amount of money that like proportionally to Radish, which is like a $3 million project, was like, the lowest amount of money that we thought was like worth even doing this for with people.
Deb has a follow-up question to a question they asked earlier. What did you use the refinance for? If to upgrade amenities, would you increase the rent to cover it? Great question.
Yes, is the short answer. So, or I'll tell you the theory and I'll tell you how this actually worked out in practice. And so the theory of it is that like we have this 5% rule, which is 5% of capital gets returned. And so when we raise more capital, let's say to do some big upgrade, we now have more capital. So we now need more income to cover that 5%. And so in theory, like when we build more things, we should be collecting more rent from people, theoretically. And it's a simple rule, which is like, if the thing costs $100,000, the new thing, we should be collecting $5,000 more of total rent that year, which is 5% of that. In practice, the way we did this is we basically like, when we bought the property, we put aside like a capital fund, and we said, okay, the property costs this much to buy and renovate, and we're going to put aside $20,000 for like future things we're going to do. And so in practice, when we did like upgrades, that's where that came from. And it was already like baked into like the rent essentially. So it was just like money we hadn't spent yet. And it's super nice to be able to have a fund you can pull from to like do community projects where you don't need to like raise a bunch of new money and go through all that hassle. It's just like there already is a fund that we already have funded. And like, if somebody's like, I want to build a garden, they can build a garden from the fund. It was like great to have that.
Awesome. Liz asks, can investors sell out easily, and can they get a return that is true to the local real estate market?
Great question. So two ways you get a return. One is when we sell the whole property. And so in that case, that is what the market says it should be, because we're selling it on the market. The other is that new residents buy you out. And so when a new resident comes in and wants to buy somebody's shares out, what we sort of say is like, it's up to you guys to figure it out. You can decide whatever the price you think is fair. And like, we're not going to get involved in that discussion. And so you'd probably have a conversation as the person who's getting bought out with like, I think it's worth this. And somebody says, I think it's worth this. And you negotiate, you find a price that you think is reasonable. But what we've generally found is that like people sometimes think they can do this with appraisals. Appraisals are like really unscientific, especially for crazy community properties. Like they do not know how to appraise these things. And so appraisals actually aren't that useful, and they tend to be like way off. We got Radish appraised twice in the same year, and it was just like the appraisal numbers were super different. And it wasn't because the market changed, it's just because appraisers don't know what to do with it. And so I wouldn't count on that as like a way to value stuff.
Jonathan is asking for offering equity for new renters. This is difficult to
Yeah,
read.
I see it here. No one. Actually, John, I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you want to maybe try to rephrase and we can come back to it?
I think they're asking, do people have to sell in order for shares to get redistributed? Or how do shares get redistributed when someone sells?
Got it. So when someone sells, or selling, like they're selling existing shares to a new person, and so there's still the same number of shares. It's just changing hands who owns them. We also create new shares as well. So if somebody puts in a new $100,000 that we use for a project at Radish, we create shares for the $100,000. We did a thing which was really nice, actually, which I recommend to everyone. And this is getting a bit into the weeds, but we basically said like the share price is going to be flat for the first 2 years. And so we said, we're going to issue new shares as like new people come in, we're doing renovations and things. But like, we're not changing the share price. It is the same share price for the first 2 years. We're not having a discussion around that. And it just really simplified like what we did in the first 2 years, which is, that's when most of the money comes into a project, I think, is like in the beginning. And so you don't want to be constantly like revaluing shares like every month that money comes in rapidly. You just want to sort of say like, this is the price. And we kept it still. I hope that makes sense.
Leo asks, could the funding be crowdsourced?
Yeah, I think it could. I think your question on the crowdsourcing, and there's a lot of now platforms for doing crowdsourcing for real estate out there, which you should check out. And so crowdsourcing has two challenges, which is, number one, you have to like give value to the people that you're crowdsourcing money from. So like, why do I want to put money into this community? Do I get access to it? Am I going to be a part of it? And you sort of need to be clear like what the thing is that they get in return. The second thing is crowdsourcing is generally capped as to like how much money people can invest. And they're always like changing the caps. I want to say, does anyone know what it is? I think it's like, I want to say it's like $10,000 or $20,000 now, but I'm not sure.
Yana wants to know, how did you attract or advertise and find prospective members / renters? What membership screening processes do you have in place?
Great question. We drew mainly from our personal networks. And I think in the beginning, so like the first 7 people that moved in, are all people we knew before. And so we sort of knew we were getting with them. And later we started adding people that were like outside of our networks who were just like passionate about the project and the community. But we sort of wanted to start with like a tight crew that we really knew. Is I have an aversion to risk and drama around people. Like I think with the initial crew, you like really want to know who you're doing stuff with.
Cool. Jenica wants to know, in your experience, are their personalities more suited to different roles of owning, buying, operating, or is it simply a passion or a monetary thing?
It's an excellent question. Uh, yeah, I think it's mostly passion and interest. Like I think everyone can figure out this stuff. It's like it sounds jargony and complicated and foreign if you haven't done it before, but it's like I didn't know how to do this stuff when I started. It's like you just do it and you figure it out. And so I think anyone with an interest can do this stuff. There's like no, you don't need a deep background. You just need the desire to go figure it out and use resources like Supernuclear. That's a plug.
Emily wants to know, you bought Radish with the plan to sell in 5 to 10 years. Do you think that newly forming groups should plan to sell their first project? Why or why not?
It's a great question. It really makes it easier. It really makes it easier to raise investment. If you don't need to say that to raise investment, don't say it. But I think philosophically, we sort of build communities for a certain stage in our life. And so my partner, Chris, and I do this, and we're like, what's the community we want to live in for the next 5-ish years? And then we build that community. And I think the answer to that question will change in 5 years. And so in 5 years, we'll probably do another one. And so I think, and maybe we hand it off to people that are still into that, but it's like, we're not seeing this as things we do for decades at a time because we don't think our life will be stable enough and our interests will be stable enough for that. That's probably a personal thing. And I would sort of reflect on like, do you think you're gonna want something different in 5 years than you want now? If so, like having a community that expires might be a good way of doing that.
Mary Kay wants to know, did fair housing law affect your rental process?
Yes, definitely follow fair housing law. So when we advertise, we follow the laws. A lot of people get brought in through our personal networks and the networks of the people that live there, in which case, that sort of is like outside of housing law. That's just like you bring in a friend to live with you. And so for most people, it doesn't come into play. But when we like go on Craigslist to advertise, we definitely follow fair housing law. We don't say we were looking for couples. We don't say we're looking for people this age. Like that's all a violation of that.
John wants to know, is there an optimal number of units in a building to buy to minimize competition and get best value?
I don't know. It's probably very dependent on market. For us, the minimum is more about how big of a community we wanted. And so we wanted to get 10 to 15 people. And so that's really what drove that decision more than anything else.
Gaia wants to know, is there a good ratio of owners to renters? How many or what percentage of members should be owners?
Yeah, good question. We're like 50% of our residents are owners right now. And so we have former residents who are still owners and we have current residents, and it's like 50%. I don't have an intuition on like what a good percentage is. But for us, it's been fine.
Vicky would like to know, how affordable is renting at Radish compared to market rate rentals? Is it accessible to folks earning low incomes?
Oh man, it's we're doing this in the Bay Area. We bought the property in 2018. It's just like, unfortunately, we're just like subject to like the prices in the Bay Area, and like the property itself just costs so much money. And like, so it's really hard to find. It's really hard to buy property in an expensive place like the Bay Area in 2018 and rent it out at very low levels. The numbers just like don't work out. You can't pay your mortgage. You can't do anything. And so like, I would love to figure out a model that works for low income folks. You're just like subject to the realities of like how much property costs. And so I think if people want to do stuff for low income folks, it's like, don't do it in the middle of the Bay Area. It's just too hard. Like there's lots of other places you can do that. Unfortunately, the Bay Area is just not one of them, and it's where we live because it's where our livelihoods are.
Gaia wants to know what typically happens to the community once you sell it.
It's a good question. We haven't gotten there yet. I'm super curious myself. I hope somebody will take it over and continue to run it as a community. That would be my hope for this, but we don't know yet.
Deb wants to know, what do you do if someone stops paying rent, and how would you handle an eviction freeze?
It hasn't happened yet. I don't know.
Okay. Brooke wants to know, how large is the Radish property and how many structures are on it?
Sorry, I should have said this up front. So Radish property is 1/3 of an acre. And it's 3 structures. Structure 1 is a 4-plex of 1-bedroom apartments. Structure 2 is a communal building that we built ourselves for our purposes. And then structure 3 is a 6-bedroom house. And so we have bedrooms for people that want to pay less money. We have apartments for people that want to pay more money, have more space. And so it sort of accommodates different like levels of income and interest.
Emily wants to know, how do you address different risk tolerance among the co-buy crew?
I mean, at the end of the day, if they're not up for the risks, it's like they sort of shouldn't be putting in a lot of money. And so it's like, or maybe I'll give a better answer. I think it's like risky for the people that put in money initially, because you don't know whether things are going to work out yet. You don't know whether people want to live there. You don't know what sort of rent you can charge. Once the thing's sort of stable and like running, it becomes a lot less risky. And so what I might say to those people are like, come help us buy it and then invest later once it's more stable. And at that point, it's like less risky.
I believe we are caught up on questions at the moment. Does anyone else have a question for Phil? Or feel that their question was unanswered? Maybe I missed it in the chat. How do you value
the big hairy goal? The big hairy goal is love and supporting community and taking care of each other. That's the big hairy goal. That's all the payoff. Guy asks, is this more of a business model for you? I think this is a good question. So the answer is no. So like, if my goal is to make money, I would not have done Radish. Radish is like way too much effort and like way too much risk and way too little return to be like worth it for that. Like there are much easier ways to make money if that is the goal. Radish is like a compromise of like, how do you form a great community and like charge as low rent as possible while still making the thing sustainable? And sustainable means that like, you got to pay your bills, you got to pay your mortgage. Otherwise it doesn't work. You can't have a community. And the people that put in a lot of money and like these communities are really expensive. Like for us, they want to put in money without a return. And so we need to give them some return. It's not a huge return. It's not like they can get better returns elsewhere. They want to do it because they want a community, but at the same time, they need something. They can't just give up the money for nothing in this risky project.
Awesome. David asks, how do you value the shares after the 2 years?
So it's a negotiation. So when you're valuing the shares, it's because somebody's selling to somebody else. And what we say is they just negotiate it themselves. And so we don't try to value them. It's just like, I think you'd probably say something like, oh, it was bought for this much. The market's gone up this much. So therefore I propose the shares should be valued this much if I was selling to Ryan, let's say. And Ryan may say, no, I don't want to pay that much. I'll pay less than that. And then we negotiate and like we come to an agreement or we don't. So we sort of don't try to like value from the top because we just don't know a good way of doing that. It's a hard problem to solve. And so we just let people work it out.
Okay. John asks, how did you identify banks to work with?
We just emailed a lot of them and said, here's a project we want to do. Here's the property. Here's the numbers. Here's our income. Here's our debt. And pick the one that was willing to play ball with us. We worked with First Republic Bank in which is a national bank. We did a construction loan, which is where you actually get some money to buy the property and then you get some money to like build something. And so we built our communal building with money from the bank. It's First Republic was willing to do this with us, and so we went with them. I don't have a great answer. Oh, one idea for how there are loan brokers out there. So there's people that like whose job it is to like know the banks that will do a thing. So like Google loan broker and find like a local loan broker, and they'll know what banks to go to for your project. They take a fee usually from the bank, so you don't pay it. Jacqueline writes, there's also cooperative loan funds. I'd love to hear more about that. I don't know that much about that. If you have any resources, feel free to post it.
David asks, if you are selling shares in the LLC, do you have to register and get approval from the federal SEC?
No, it's there's basically like an exemption around selling shares to like friends of like a privately held LLC that you're not advertising. I think the key thing is that you can't advertise it. And so we don't have anyone like advertising buying shares in Radish. Yeah.
Ryan asked, did you run into issues with zoning?
Oh yeah. Such pain, Ryan. Zoning is a nightmare to deal with. Zoning's not built for community living in most places. And so you're always like, it's always like square peg, round hole all day long. And so you just got to figure out how to jam the square peg in the round hole. And so we went to zoning and said, we want to build this communal building so 13 people can like have meals together and share and like have community. And they said, we don't have that in our zoning code. Sorry, you can't build it. And then we came back and said, okay, we're a single family who wants to build a new building just to expand our big single family home. Will you approve that? And they're like, oh yeah, we'll approve that. And so you just sort of need to like know the thing they'll approve and like ask for it. And then once it's built, you can use it however you want.
Are there things you could put into place to help assure that the community continues after you sell?
It's a really good question. We haven't thought about that much yet because we're still many years away from that. But you know, I think when we start getting closer to that, we'll probably be feeling people out for like who wants to buy this thing out and take it over. As we sort of told the investors like you'll be able to get out, and so we want to uphold that commitment. We don't want to backstab them, you know, at the end. And so we'll need to like raise money to get people out who we told we'll be able to get out. We really would like that to come from the community so the community can continue.
Gaia asked, have you considered establishing communities via community land trust so as to take it out of the market and allow for longevity of the community to be affordable?
It's a great question. I love land trust models. I think they're super cool. I think people should explore them. We didn't do it. It was too much complexity to solve for our case. And given that we didn't know whether we wanted this to last for decades, like it just didn't seem to make sense for us to go down that route. I think land trust models are great. I know FIC does a lot of stuff here. Other people may have resources. I love when people explore this stuff. I'll tell you, it's like not an easy route. It's like, it's hard to get loans. It's hard to figure out legally how to do it. There's not that many of them. I really want people to do more of them. I would love people to write case studies on them. If you have a case done on them, I'd love to publish on Super Nuclear. But I will warn you, it's not an easy route. And part of the reason we didn't do it is because like we actually wanted this to happen. And so we tried to make things easy on ourselves, not hard on ourselves.
Katie's wondering if you have any advice for a more rural situation, like how to make that work.
Yeah. You know, so I think the big advice in a rural situation is you gotta pick a place where like zoning and land use is easy. If you're battling the authorities all day to do the things you want to do, your life's gonna be a nightmare. If you're not, then you know you can let all your creativity flourish. I think that would be the big thing. Loans can be harder if you're buying land, so banks don't lend as easily to like land as they do to buildings. So just be aware of that. It can be done. It's just harder sometimes. So you have a bit more of a financing challenge. But I think there's gonna be a lot of rural communities coming up soon. And I'm excited to see them. Please invite me if you build one.
Emily is wondering what portion of your investors are not residents, and vice versa. How many of your residents are not investors?
We have 14 residents. I'm guessing half of them are investors, half are not. We have 13 investors, so there's 6 people who are not residents who are investors. A couple of them are people, just supporters, who want to put in money to help us do it, who don't live there and never have. A couple of them are former residents. So there's people that have lived there, have moved on for various reasons, and have kept their money in the project.
All right. I think we are once again caught up on questions. Does anybody else have any more? Jonathan said, have you found any creative way to quantify the other impact elements of the investment opportunity? People are willing to take less returns because they believe in the project, but curious how you frame this to investors.
The people that invested in Radish want to be part of the Radish larger community, but they don't want to live there. And so it's like they want this thing to exist because they see it will be a great thing for them to have in their universe. They want to come over, they want to hang out, they want to hang in the hot tub, they want to have dinner with us. They want to, be part of the community, have friends, do projects. They just, for whatever reason, don't want to live there. Maybe they don't live. And so I think it's like it's selling like what the existence of the thing can mean for you personally. If you have another social mission, like let's say you're in low-income housing, you're doing cool, innovative stuff on off-grid stuff, or like there could be other reasons that people want to invest in this because they want to see it in the world. But like you got to have a vision that people want to see in the world, and or that benefits them directly. And so it's got to be one of those two things.
Sylvia asked, what processes do you use if there are communication issues?
That is a whole nother thing. We use some version of MVC. It's a little tailored to us. The sort of communication, I would say MVC is probably the easy way to answer it, but that's a whole nother thing. Could we end on Chris's question?
Sure. Chris wanted to know, if you were to do this all over again, is there one thing you would do differently?
Yes. Good question, Chris. The one thing I would do differently, I think it's like learning to enjoy the process. Like the process felt stressful. Like it's hard to do these things. And it's like, I think you have to like have some like levity and some like non-attachment to the outcomes of the process for the process to go well. And like, I think you're going to have a couple swings and misses oftentimes before you hit. And I think we were getting down on ourselves that it wasn't working. And we were like, we made it hard on ourselves emotionally. And so I think just knowing it's going to happen at the right time, it's going to happen to the right people, and just having that faith.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil. There's a lot of awesome information here, and
great questions, everyone.
Yeah.
Ryan, thanks for reading them all out.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you everyone for coming. We'd love to hear how the session went for you and anything that we could do to improve future events. I'm putting a link in the chat box now. We'd love if you'd fill out this evaluation form. We read each and every one, and it helps us improve our events in the future. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, we would really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Phil.
Thank you, everyone. Awesome chatting.